The year was 1872, and spring had come late to the Texas frontier. The Red River ran swollen and brown from the rains, winding like a restless serpent between the scrub hills and the distant mesas. The air smelled of wet cedar and dust. The land split between green promise and the memory of fire. It was a country that belonged to no one, yet everyone bled for it. Among those wandering the borderlands was Tahan, once a proud Comanche warrior, now an outcast. The people who had called him brother had painted his name in shame. He had disobeyed his war chief, sparing a group of settlers during a raid on the Brazos Trail. He had refused to kill a white child hiding beneath a wagon. For that act of mercy, the council branded him Tuba Numu, the man without tribe. His horse had been taken, his hair cut short in disgrace. He was left to wander with only his knife, his bow, and the ghosts of his people's songs. For months, he lived like a shadow, hunting by night, sleeping in the shelter of rocks. His only companions were the coyotes that trailed his campfire and the whisper of the wind that still spoke in Comanche. Hunger gnawed his ribs, but it was loneliness that hollowed him. The plains, once alive with the thunder of hooves and the cries of warriors, now felt like a graveyard of old glories. It was near Fort Belknap, at a bend in the Red River, that fate brought him into the sight of Eliza McGraw. She was just 19, the daughter of a homesteader from Missouri, who had come west in search of cheap land and a better sky. The Kiowa raid that spring had stolen both her mother and her peace. Her father lay inside their broken cabin with a fever that wouldn't break. Their stock was gone, their crops trampled, and what remained of the family fortune was a rifle with no bullets and a stubborn will to survive. Tahan first saw her at dawn. She knelt by the riverbank, washing blood-stained rags in the current, her hair loose and shining like pale wheat, her bare feet pressed into the mud, and though her hands worked, her eyes were far away, fixed on the horizon as if expecting ghosts. Her father coughed weakly from the cabin above the bank, a sound of defeat carried on the wind. The Comanche crouched in the mesquite, watching. He could have turned away. She was white, one of the people who had burned his camps, driven his kin from their sacred lands. But there was something in her face that struck him, not beauty in the common sense, but a look of someone caught between the same worlds he wandered, alone, lost, fighting to live. A branch cracked under his knee. She spun, eyes wide, the river dripping from her hands. The moment stretched, her pale face against the morning light, his dark figure framed in shadow. For an instant they were just man and woman, the rest of the world forgotten. He raised his hands slowly, palms open. His knife hung harmlessly at his belt. "Don't run," he said, his English thick but steady. Eliza froze, clutching her wet cloth to her chest. "You Indian?" she stammered. He nodded once. "Comanche. No war now. No tribe." Her breath came fast, her mind racing. Every story she'd heard about the Comanche was a tale of terror, scalping, torture, slaughter. Yet something about his eyes stopped her from screaming. They weren't cruel. They were tired, deep, sad. He reached into the pouch at his waist and drew out a strip of dried venison, laying it on a flat stone between them. Then he stepped back. "For you," he said simply. She shook her head, still trembling. I don't take charity." He looked at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "Not charity, life." Then, as silently as he had come, he vanished into the trees, leaving only his shadow and the smell of smoke on the breeze. That night, Eliza sat by her father's bedside, listening to his breathing grow weaker. Her thoughts drifted back to the man by the river, the stranger who spoke softly and walked like a ghost. Who was he? Why had he helped her? She told herself she was foolish to think of him. Yet as she lay awake, she dreamed of dark eyes watching from the prairie and a voice whispering words she didn't understand. The next morning, she found a fresh rabbit hanging from the cabin post. There were no tracks in the mud, only a single feather tied with a leather cord. She held it in her hands, feeling a strange warmth rise in her chest. Over the next weeks, she caught glimpses of him at the edge of the woods, always distant, never near. Sometimes she found small offerings left at her door, a strip of dried meat, a handful of corn, once even a small carved figure of a horse. At first she feared him. Then she began to wait for him. The loneliness that had nearly broken her began to ease, replaced by something she couldn't name. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, she walked down to the river alone. The wind carried a song, low, haunting, unlike any hymn she knew. She followed it through the reeds until she saw him standing by the water's edge, his head bowed. He turned as she approached, surprise flickering in his eyes. "You should not be here," he said softly. "Neither should you," she replied. For the first time he smiled, a small fleeting thing. Maybe so. They stood together in silence, the river murmuring between them. She noticed the scars on his arms, the cuts of battle, the lines of hardship. He noticed the way her eyes met his without fear. In that moment, the distance between their worlds felt smaller than the space between breaths. When she left, he did not stop her. But as she climbed the riverbank, she heard his voice behind her, barely above the wind. "You are not afraid?" She turned. "Should I be?" He shook his head. "No, not of me." And when she smiled, just barely, the first real smile since her mother's death, Tahan knew he would stay near, even if it meant never finding his people again. The Red River turned quieter in the weeks that followed, its spring fury fading to a low murmur beneath the Texas sun. Grass grew thick again where the flood had torn the banks, and the land, stubborn as ever, tried to heal. But some wounds were slower to close, the kind that sat in a man's heart or in a girl's eyes. Tahan watched from the mesquite hills above the McGraw cabin. From afar, the world looked still, almost peaceful, just a lone smoke trail from her chimney, a woman's small shape moving among the fence posts, a horse's skeleton bleaching in the grass. But Tahan saw deeper. He saw how her shoulders sagged when she thought no one was looking, how her hands shook when she tried to draw water from the well, how she looked to the tree line every dusk, half expecting ghosts. He had once been a hunter of men, fierce and untamed. Now in exile, he was a silent guardian, keeping watch not from pride but from something else, something dangerous and new. He did not yet call it love, for the word did not fit the way the wind fit a bird's wing. It was instinct, not choice. He left small signs of his presence, never enough to frighten her, just enough to help. A rabbit left by her steps, a repaired snare. Once, after a storm, he found her fence torn down by the wind. By dawn, it stood upright again, mended with rawhide cord. Rumors soon began to whisper through the valley. Settlers at the trading post spoke of an Indian ghost haunting the Red River bend, one who protected the McGraw girl. A soldier from Fort Griffin swore he saw smoke rising from her chimney one night, and a dark figure walking the riverbank. Others said she'd gone mad, talking to the wind, singing to shadows. When a pair of ranchers stopped by her homestead to trade, they asked slyly if she'd seen anything strange. "Only God's mercy and my own 2 hands," she told them, her chin lifted. But when they rode off laughing, she went straight to the river and waited. The day was hot, the air heavy with gnats. She sat under a cottonwood, twisting her mother's silver ring between her fingers. When the shadows grew long, she heard the soft tread of moccasins behind her. "You should not wait for me," Tahan said quietly. His English was careful, the vowels shaped by another tongue. Eliza turned, startled but not afraid. "Then why do you keep coming?" He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the water. "I do not know." They stood in silence, the wind tugging at the edge of her shawl. His presence was different this time, closer, warmer, less like a ghost and more like something real. She noticed the faint tremor in his hand as he adjusted the strap of his bow. "You could go north," she said softly, "or west. There must be somewhere you can start again." He shook his head. "An exile starts nowhere. The land forgets his name." Her heart ached at the truth in his voice. She wanted to say something, something kind, something foolish. But before she could, thunder cracked in the distance. A storm was coming. They ran for the shelter of a half-collapsed barn near the river. Inside, the smell of rain mingled with old hay and dust. Lightning flashed through the broken boards, throwing his face into silver relief, the sharp cheekbones, the steady, unflinching eyes. Eliza sat on a bale, clutching her shawl. "When they tell stories about you," she said, "they say Comanches steal girls and burn farms." He watched the rain streak the boards. "We take what was taken first." There was no anger in his tone, just fact. She nodded slowly. "And now?" "Now I take nothing," he said. "I guard what I should not want." The words hung between them, heavy as thunder. After the storm passed, he left without a word. Yet she could not forget how he'd looked at her in the lightning's glow, not with hunger, but with something quieter, more dangerous. The days grew longer. Summer came with cicadas and dust devils, and with it came soldiers from Fort Griffin, patrolling the frontier for Indian stragglers. Their captain, a hard-eyed man named Jesse Harlan, stopped by her cabin under pretense of checking for danger. He was kind in the way of men who think they are owed gratitude. "You live alone here, Miss McGraw?" he asked, looking around her small home. "My father's too sick to travel," she said. "We'll move when he's better." Harlan tipped his hat, but his eyes lingered too long. "If you see anything, any Indians or half-breeds, send word to the fort. They've been known to hide near the river." That night, Eliza barred the door and stayed awake by the fire. When the first light crept through the shutters, she found another gift on her porch, a tanned deer hide neatly folded, and beside it, carved into the post with a flint knife, a small symbol, a circle split by a single line. She didn't know its meaning, but her heart understood. It meant he had seen the soldiers and he would not come near for a while. The days dragged. Her father's fever worsened. Food grew scarce. Sometimes she thought she heard his voice at the edge of her dreams, soft, low, like wind over grass. When she woke, the emptiness around her felt too wide to bear. One night, desperate, she took her rifle and walked to the river. The moon lay white on the water, and her hands trembled as she loaded the last bullet she had. The barrel was rusted, the powder damp. When she fired, the shot misfired with a dull crack and the force knocked her backward into the mud. She screamed, not from pain but from sheer helplessness. Then from the dark beyond the trees came the sound of footsteps. Tahan emerged from the shadows, carrying a bow and a rabbit slung from his belt. His face was hard, but his eyes were full of something close to sorrow. "You will die if you stay," he said. She wiped her tears angrily. "I'm already dying." He crouched beside her, setting the rabbit down gently. "No, you live." "You fight." She turned her face away, ashamed that he saw her weakness. But when she looked back, he was gone, vanished into the thicket, leaving only the smell of smoke and sagebrush. By morning, the rabbit was roasted on her hearth, and so the strange bond continued, half shadow, half miracle. The settlers whispered, the soldiers wondered, and every time Eliza walked by the river, she felt the invisible thread between her and the exiled Comanche titan, pulling her toward something both forbidden and fated. One evening, as the sun died in crimson light, she heard his song again, a haunting chant carried on the breeze. She followed it through the willows until she found him sitting on a rock, gazing west. He didn't turn as she approached. "You should not come," he said. She smiled sadly. "You said that before. And you did not listen." "I never do." He looked at her then, his dark eyes unreadable. "You are brave." She shook her head. "No, just lonely." He nodded slowly, as if that were the same thing. For a long moment neither spoke. The air smelled of wild mint and rain. Fireflies began to blink between the reeds. Finally, she said, "If anyone finds out you've been near me, they will hang me," he finished. She swallowed hard. "Then why risk it?" He met her gaze, his voice barely a whisper. "Because I am already dead to them." Then he rose and walked into the darkness, leaving her with the sound of the river and the ache of something she could not name, but would soon learn was love. By midsummer of that long, punishing year, the earth itself seemed to crack open beneath the Texas sun. The Red River shrank to a chain of shallow pools where cattle bones gleamed white, and the air shimmered like hot glass above the prairie. The wind carried the dry rattle of grasshoppers and the far-off cry of hawks. Inside the lonely McGraw cabin, time had slowed to the rhythm of a dying man's breath. Eliza's father, fever-ridden and lost in delirium, muttered names that belonged to the past. Her mother, Missouri, home. Day after day she boiled water, changed bandages, and prayed to a God who no longer seemed to answer. The last of their flour was gone. The well was nearly dry. Each sunset brought the fear that the night would take him. Tahan watched all this from the ridge. The once fierce warrior had grown thinner, his face carved by both hunger and restraint. Every instinct urged him to go to her, to bring food, to guard her door. But he knew the soldiers still rode patrols along the river. A Comanche near a white woman's home would be shot before he could speak. One evening, as thunder rolled over the plains, Tahan saw the thin line of smoke from her chimney falter and die. That sign, the death of fire, meant surrender. He waited until darkness, then descended the slope like a shadow. When he reached the cabin, the door stood open, swinging on its hinge. Eliza knelt beside her father's bed, his hand limp in hers. She was whispering through her tears, her voice breaking on every breath. "He's gone," she said when she noticed the figure in the doorway. Her voice was dull, her face streaked with ash and grief. "He left me here alone." Tahan entered slowly, hat in hand, his moccasins silent on the floorboards. He looked down at the still body beneath the blanket, then back at her. "The spirit walks on," he said softly in his own tongue. "You stay." "I don't want to stay." The words slipped from her lips before she could stop them. They were the truest she had ever spoken. She had fought so long, through hunger, fear, and loss, that when the fight was suddenly over, she felt hollow, weightless, ready to drift away like dust on the wind. Tahan crouched beside her. He had seen many deaths of warriors, of kin, of the innocent, but this one struck something deeper. She looked so small in that moment, so breakable. "You live," he said quietly. "You are strong." She laughed, a bitter sound. "Strong? Look at me. I can't even bury him alone." He rose without another word, stepped outside, and returned with a spade he'd fashioned from an old wagon part. Together they worked under the heavy night sky, digging a grave behind the cabin where the cottonwoods grew. When the earth closed over her father, Eliza whispered a prayer and Tahan stood beside her, silent as stone. When it was done, she turned to him. Moonlight touched her face, pale, streaked with dirt and tears, her hair undone. She whispered, "There's nothing left now." Tahan's hand hovered near her shoulder, uncertain. "There is the river," he said. "There is breath." Breath for what? He did not answer. Words had never been his gift. But his eyes, dark and steady, said what his tongue could not. "For you, the wind stirred the branches." She trembled, not from fear this time, but from the strange nearness between them. He reached toward her then, slow as if approaching a wild creature. His hand stopped an inch from her face, trembling. "What if I touch you?" he asked. The words were low, rough, and filled with everything he dared not show. The hunger, the gentleness, the forbidden longing. Eliza's breath caught. For weeks she had dreamed of this, of the man who came and went like wind, who spoke with his eyes instead of his tongue, who treated her not as prey but as something sacred. Her mind screamed no. The world would call it sin. Madness, but her body betrayed her with a trembling breath. A step forward. A single tear that caught the moonlight. He took that as answer. When his fingers brushed her cheek, the world seemed to go still. His touch was calloused, yet careful, reverent. It wasn't lust that moved between them, but recognition. Two exiles finding the same loneliness mirrored in another's soul. Her skin burned beneath his hand, and she closed her eyes, leaning into it as if the warmth might bring her father back, her old life back, or maybe just herself. He let his thumb trace the line of her jaw, down to where her pulse beat fast against her throat. Then as quickly as it began, he withdrew, his hand falling to his side. "I should not have done that," he said. "No," she whispered. "You should have." A long silence followed. Somewhere out on the plains, a coyote called, lonely and thin. Tahan turned away, his breath ragged. "Your people would kill me for less. They already killed you once," she said softly. "What's one more death?" He looked back at her then, something fierce and desperate in his eyes. For the first time she saw not the stoic exile, but the man beneath, the one torn apart by honor and desire, by the cruel boundary between their worlds. He left before dawn. Eliza woke to find the cabin empty, a basket of smoked meat by the door and a trail of moccasin prints leading to the river. She followed them until they vanished in the reeds, then knelt and touched the damp earth as though she could still feel his warmth there. For days she waited, hoping he would return, but he didn't. Not while the soldiers still patrolled. Not while the settlers' gossip grew sharper. They said the McGraw girl had gone half mad, talking to shadows. Some claimed she'd been bewitched by an Indian spirit. One evening, a squad from Fort Griffin rode by. The new lieutenant, Harlan again, warned her of Comanche stragglers seen near the hills. "They're dangerous," he said. "If one comes near you, shoot first. We'll take care of the body." She smiled tightly, hand on the doorframe. I'll remember that. That night she sat by her window, rifle across her knees, heart aching in a way no sermon could ease. She wanted to hate Tahan for leaving, but she couldn't. His absence filled the room like another presence, and she found herself whispering into the dark. What if you touch me again? The moon gave no answer. Only the river replied, murmuring softly, carrying his memory downstream. 2 weeks later he returned. He came just before dawn, when the mist still hung low over the fields. Eliza was outside hanging laundry, her hair loose, her eyes red from sleepless nights. When she saw him walking up the path, she dropped the sheet she held. I thought you were gone, she said. I was, he replied, but the wind carried your cry. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then she stepped forward and he met her halfway. There were no more words. He touched her face again, bolder now, certain, and she did not pull away. It was that moment, that quiet surrender, that sealed their fate. For somewhere beyond the hills, the soldiers would soon find the trail of an exile who dared to love a white woman, and they would come for him with ropes and rifles. But for now, in the half-light of morning, with the river whispering and the world holding its breath, there was only the touch that changed everything. The summer sun scorched the plains that year until even the mesquite trees bent under its weight. The Red River had shrunk to a trickle, its cracked bed littered with the bones of fish and cattle. The air shimmered with heat and dust, and every living thing seemed to hide in the shade, except for 2 hearts that had already burned past fear and reason. After that first touch, Eliza and Tahan found themselves drawn together as though the wind itself conspired to keep them near. What began as secret glances and brief meetings by the river turned into nights beneath the wide, starlit sky where the rest of the world fell away. He would come to her cabin only when the moon was thin, moving silent as smoke. Sometimes he brought food, dried meat, berries, or water from hidden springs. Sometimes he brought nothing at all but his presence, and that was enough. They spoke little, for words were clumsy things between 2 people who had already said too much without them. Under the blanket of the prairie sky, she would lie beside him, listening to the heartbeat she'd once thought belonged to an enemy. He would trace the stars with his finger, naming them in Comanche. "Sona," he'd whisper, pointing upward. "The bear." She would repeat the words, soft and uncertain, until they sounded like their own secret language. Eliza had never known peace before him. Her world had been built on duty, fear, and survival. But with Tahan, she felt something older than either of their worlds, something sacred. And yet, every time he left before dawn, a piece of her heart went with him into the wild. But peace has a way of drawing envy. The settlers had begun to notice. Tracks that didn't belong, unfamiliar smoke near her chimney. Whispers spread like wildfire. The McGraw girl was harboring a savage. That she'd taken him into her bed. That she'd turned her back on God. One afternoon, as Eliza rode into the trading post for salt and grain, the women turned their backs to her. A child pointed and whispered, "That's her, the Indian's woman." The storekeeper, who once greeted her kindly, now handed her the goods in silence. When she turned to leave, Captain Jesse Harlan was waiting by his horse, arms folded, a smirk hidden behind the brim of his hat. "Miss McGraw," he said smoothly, "there's talk in town. They say you've had company." She gripped the reins tighter. "If gossip's all you've come for, I've work waiting." He stepped in her path. "Now don't take offense. We're just making sure you're safe. A woman alone out here, if a Comanche's been sniffing around, we can take care of him for you." "I don't need your kind of care," she snapped. Harlan's smile thinned. "You'd best remember who keeps the peace on this land. If that Indian's been near, it won't end kindly for either of you." He tipped his hat and rode off, leaving her shaking with rage and fear. That night, she met Tahan at the river, her hands still trembling. "They know," she whispered. "The soldiers. The whole town. You have to go." He looked out toward the dark horizon where lightning flashed faintly over the distant hills. "There is nowhere left to go. You'll die if you stay." He met her eyes. "Then I die where my heart is buried." She wanted to scream at him, to beg, to curse the cruel land that made love a crime. Instead, she stepped forward, clutching his face in her hands. "If I lose you, I'll have nothing." He covered her hands with his own, rough and warm. "You have the river, the sky. The memory of me, she shook her head. I want more than memory, so they stayed. Night after night, they defied the world that had branded them enemies. Love in those days was not soft, it was survival. It was whispered promises in the dark, stolen moments between danger and dawn. But fate is always listening. One gray morning, before the sun had risen, the thunder of hooves shattered the silence. Bounty hunters, 3 of them, hard men with rifles and the smell of whiskey on their breath, rode into the clearing. Eliza heard them before she saw them, her heart freezing as she recognized Harlan's voice shouting orders. Surround the cabin. The Indians near. Tahan had been sleeping inside, his bow and knife within reach. By the time the door burst open, he was already moving, a flash of motion, silent and swift. The first man fell with an arrow in his shoulder before he could raise his gun. Harlan fired through the doorway, the bullet grazing Tahan's arm. The warrior rolled behind the hearth, his eyes narrowing. The second bounty hunter crashed through a window, and the fight that followed was quick and brutal. Steel and smoke, blood and fire. When it was over, 2 men lay dead. The third, Harlan, stood outside, gun smoking, fury etched in his face. He called out, "You can't hide him forever, girl. Step aside and I'll spare your life." Eliza stepped into the doorway, her father's old rifle trembling in her hands. "You'll have to kill me first," Harlan sneered. "You'd throw your life away for a savage?" She steadied the rifle. "He's worth more than every coward in that fort." Before he could aim, Tahan lunged through the smoke, tackling Harlan to the ground. They struggled, fists in fury, until the captain's pistol went off, once, twice. A cry split the air. For a moment all was still. Then Eliza saw Tahan stagger back, clutching his side. "No!" she screamed, rushing forward. She caught him before he fell, his blood staining her hands. Harlan, bleeding from a cut above his eye, backed toward his horse. "He's done for," he spat. "You'll hang for this." Then he fled, leaving them in the rising dust. Eliza half dragged, half carried Tahan inside. She tore her skirt to press against the wound, whispering, "Stay with me. Please stay." He smiled faintly, his breath shallow. "I told you, I would die where my heart is buried." "Don't say that," she pleaded. "You'll live. You'll heal." He lifted a hand, brushing her cheek. "If the wind carries my name, follow it. It will lead you home." Then he slipped into darkness. For 2 days she kept him alive by sheer will, refusing sleep, feeding him drops of water, whispering prayers. But she knew they would come again. Harlan would return with soldiers, and they would show no mercy. When she saw the dust of their horses on the horizon, she made her choice. She packed what she could, a little food, her father's Bible, and the feathered Tahan had once left on her porch. Then with all her strength, she helped him onto his horse and led him toward the western hills. They rode through the night, the stars cold and silent above. Behind them, flames rose from her cabin, the soldiers burning it to the ground. Ahead, the land stretched endless and wild, the last refuge of the doomed and the brave. By dawn, they crossed the Red River into Indian territory. Tahan could barely sit upright, his skin pale, his breath ragged. When the sun rose, he looked at her and said weakly, "Now, you are exiled too." She took his hand, tears glinting on her lashes. Then exile has meaning. And though they both knew the price of their desire had not yet been paid, they rode on together, 2 souls bound by a love the world had no place for. The borderlands were cruel country, endless red dust, thorned brush, and skies so wide they could swallow a man whole. For days, Eliza and Tahan rode west through the badlands, following the winding path of dry creeks and the ghost trails of buffalo. The earth baked beneath the August sun, and the silence between them was heavy, sacred, and full of ache. Tahan's wound had not healed. The bullet had torn through his side, leaving him weak and fevered. Still he rode upright, refusing to fall before her. Every mile was a battle against his own body, every breath drawn through pain. When he swayed in the saddle, Eliza reached across to steady him. "Rest," she begged. "Please, you can't keep going like this." He shook his head, sweat gleaming on his temples. "If I stop, they will find us." Behind them lay a trail of smoke and vengeance. Captain Harlan would not let the insult go unpunished. He had lost 2 men in his pride. Word would spread from Fort Griffin to every outpost. There was a bounty on the Comanche outlaw, and the white woman who rode with him. They camped that night in the shadow of a sandstone bluff. The moon rose red, blood red, hanging low over the horizon like a watching eye. Tahan called it Piakura, the ghost moon. In Comanche belief, it was a sign that the dead walked the earth seeking peace. He built a small fire, though the flames pained him to tend. Eliza knelt beside him, wrapping his side with a strip torn from her dress. Her fingers trembled as she worked, her heart breaking at how pale he had grown. "You saved me," she whispered. "Now let me save you." He smiled faintly, his eyes dimming like embers. "You already have." She pressed her hand against his chest, feeling the weak but steady thump of his heart. "Don't you dare leave me now," she said. Not after everything. But even as she said it, she felt the weight of fate closing in around them. The prairie was too open, too vast. There was nowhere left to hide. The next morning, the sun rose into a haze of dust. Tahan's fever worsened, his words slipping between English and Comanche, fragments of old songs and prayers. By midday, they reached the ruins of an abandoned mission near the Rio Rojo, a crumbling stone chapel left behind by Spanish priests long before the war. Inside, the air was cool and still. Eliza laid him upon the worn altar and washed his face with water from her canteen. The cracked crucifix above them watched silently, as if it too understood the futility of human laws in the face of love. He stirred, his hand finding hers. "You cry," he murmured. "I'm praying," she lied. He smiled weakly. "You pray in tears." She bent over him, her tears falling on his chest. "If there's a God up there, he'll hear me." Outside, the sky darkened with dust clouds, not storm clouds, but the smoke of riders. She heard the distant drumbeat of hooves. Her breath caught. "They found us." Tahan tried to sit up, but his strength failed. "Go," he rasped. "Take the horse. Ride north, live. I won't leave you." "You must. The world will not forgive you for loving me." "Then I'll have no world," she said fiercely. He looked at her a long moment, his eyes filled with sorrow and pride. "You are brave, so high, white dove. But the world takes from the brave." She brushed his hair back from his brow, her hands trembling. "If they take you, they'll have to take me too." The riders came at dusk, 5 soldiers led by Captain Harlan, their silhouettes sharp against the red light. They surrounded the mission, rifles drawn. The captain dismounted, his face streaked with dust and fury. "Step away from him, Eliza," he barked. "He's finished. Don't throw your life away." She stood in the doorway, rifle in hand. Her dress was torn, her hair wild in the wind, her eyes blazing like firelight. "I told you once," she said. "You'll have to kill me first." Harlan raised his pistol. "Don't tempt me, girl. You've disgraced your blood, your people, your God." She fired. The shot tore through his arm, knocking him backward. Before the soldiers could react, she shouted, "Run, Tahan!" "Go," but he did not run. He rose, weak, bleeding, but defiant, and stepped into the open, bow in hand. His first arrow flew true, striking the nearest soldier in the chest. The others returned fire, bullets cracking against the stone walls. Eliza dropped beside him, reloading as fast as she could. Smoke filled the air. The horses screamed. The red dust churned beneath their boots. It was chaos, raw and desperate. Then came the sound of another gunshot, closer this time. Eliza felt the air shatter beside her. She turned. Tahan had fallen to his knees, clutching his chest. "No," she screamed, crawling to him. She caught him before he hit the ground, pressing her hand over the wound. "Stay with me. Please stay." He smiled faintly, his breath shallow. "The land calls me home." Harlan staggered forward, bleeding but alive, his gun still raised. "He's done. It's over." Eliza turned on him, eyes blazing. "It'll never be over." She fired again, the bullet grazing his temple. Harlan dropped his gun, stumbling back in disbelief. "You're mad," he spat. "He's a savage. You damn your soul for him?" She pressed her forehead against Tahan's and whispered, "My soul was his the moment he touched me." Then, before Harlan could lift his weapon again, she seized Tahan's knife and threw it with all her strength. It struck true deep into the captain's throat. He fell without a sound. The remaining soldiers fled, their courage broken by the sight of a dying Comanche and a wild-eyed girl who had defied both heaven and earth. The sun sank behind the hills, and the blood moon rose once more. Its crimson light filled the mission, painting the stone walls like a cathedral of fire. Eliza cradled Tahan's head in her lap, humming a broken lullaby. His breathing slowed, his eyes half-lidded, gazing not at her but beyond, to a place she could not follow. "The earth keeps what it loves," he whispered. "I am not gone." Her tears fell onto his lips. "Then let the earth take me too." He smiled faintly, a ghost of the man he'd been. No, you live, tell them. Love is stronger. And with that, the last breath left him. The night fell utterly still. Eliza stayed there until dawn, her hands stained with his blood, her heart empty and yet full in a way that could never be taken from her. When the first light touched the horizon, she buried him beneath the cottonwoods behind the mission, wrapping his body in the deer hide he'd once given her. She placed his knife beside him, along with the small carved horse he'd made. On the mound she set a feather, white, untarnished, and whispered, "The wind will carry your name." Then she rode east, back across the Red River. Months later, travelers spoke of a woman living by the water, dressed in plain clothes, tending a small patch of earth where wildflowers grew. They said she spoke little, but every evening, she walked to the river's edge and listened as though the wind might bring her a voice from the far hills. And sometimes, when the moon rose red and full, she would lift her face to the sky and whisper, "What if I touch you again?" Then she'd close her eyes and smile, for in the rustle of the grass, the whisper of the current, and the heartbeat of the land, she could almost hear his answer, "You already do."